kept hitting gray and gray just now, but before I could tell by the swirling. And I was like, something's wrong. So I came back. Hopefully it'll just be that. I did unplug the computer. Maybe that'll keep it from like overheating. I think we should. Hey, there you are. Hi. Yes, returning for the return. Mm. Yes. During the Democratic primary, hi, John. FBI Associate Director Clyde Tolson was presiding over an executive meeting when Bobby's name came up. I hope someone shoots and kills the son of a bitch, said Tolson. A lot of people shared the sentiment, and at least one man was prepared to act on it. After Bobby won the California primary on the evening of June 4th, he made a victory speech to his campaign supporters in the ballroom of a hotel shortly after midnight of the 5th. When Bobby left the podium, he walked through the hotel's kitchen on his way to a late night news conference when multiple shots were fired at him from at least one assassin from the front, although County Coroner Thomas Noguchi said that 3 bullets hit Bobby from the rear, with the fatal shot fired from less than 1 inch from Kennedy's head, behind his right ear. After extensive neurosurgery, Bobby lingered in critical condition for another day, then died. At the time of the incident, Eugene Hale Brading, who mysteriously disappeared in Dealey Plaza on the day of Jack Kennedy's assassination, was only a block away from the scene when Bobby was shot. On June 8th, Bobby's funeral service was held at New York's St. Patrick's Cathedral, and although J. Edgar Hoover was in the city that day and staying at the Waldorf Astoria, which is a 5-minute walk to the cathedral, he did not attend the service. With Bobby out of the race, Hubert Humphrey secured the Democratic nomination, but lost the general election to Republican Richard Nixon. Ed Parton accused Nixon of receiving a suitcase stuffed with $500,000 in cash from none other than Carlos Marcello, who hoped Nixon would pardon Hoffa. Attorney and lobbyist Irving Davidson, as well as other Washington insiders, confirmed Parton's claim, and by 1968, it seemed that Hoffa, with Marcello's assistance, had helped the right president into the White House. While it became increasingly clear that Hoffa had put the wrong president inside the Marble Palace, the year before Hoffa went to prison, he called a meeting with his executive board to tell them that Frank Fitzsimmons would be in charge of the union while he was away. Frank Fritz Fitzsimmons, or Fitzsimmons, was born near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on April 7, 1908. The family left for Detroit while he was still a boy. As a young man, Fitz quit school and worked the loading dock for an auto parts company until he landed a job as a bus driver for the Detroit Motor Bus Company, then a long-distance hauler for the Teamsters. Hoffa took him into his inner circle. Frank the Tank, is that for Big Brother? Frank, Beauty, where Fitz should have enjoyed a sense of prestige, but instead became known around the Marble Palace as Hoffa's shoeshine boy, often used to fetch sandwiches and pour coffee. One Detroit journalist who interviewed while the later drank a glass of whiskey called him unbelievably stupid. But Fitz was much smarter than he let on. He not only collected a large salary with perks, but used his proximity to Hoffa to cut quiet deals on the side. Because Hoffa was known to humiliate Fitz in the presence of others, Teamster executives were stunned when Hoffa chose him as their new leader. What was Hoffa thinking? For a long Harold Gibbons was expected to take the helm if Hoffa was ever removed by death or criminal conviction. But Gibbons had made a crucial mistake following the assassination of President Kennedy. Hoffa who was in a Miami restaurant when he heard the news from Dealey Plaza, got up on the table and cheered, while Harold Gibbons, who was in Washington, D.C., ordered the flags atop the Marble Palace flown at half staff. When Hoffa was told about this, he called Washington and screamed at Gibbons, "Why the hell did you do that for him? Who the hell was he?" Hoffa's reaction took Gibbons by surprise. It also took him out of the running for the Teamster leadership, since Hoffa distrusted anyone who expressed sympathy for the late president. Gibbons was also unacquainted with the key mobsters whose power was needed to run the Union. The same reason Hoffa had to overlook another prime candidate, Bobby Holmes, the smart and tough Yorkshire native with a British accent, had never dealt with the mob, and there's no crash course for navigating that rough terrain, unlike the corrupt Fitz, who, as one lawmaker said, the Detroit mob had a high regard for. After assuming the Teamster leadership, Fitz did not immediately abandon his sycophantic ruse, telling Hoffa, "When you get out, the keys will be right here. Don't worry about a thing." Although Hoffa was locked away in Lewisburg Penitentiary, his office inside the Marble Palace remained unchanged. Sure, Fitz enjoyed swiveling around in Hoffa's big executive chair and barking orders into the intercom, but Hoffa's framed awards and family photographs still adorned the desk and walls. But as the seat cushion began to take shape around the pudgy man's ass, his true character emerged and the office changed accordingly. Like executed Bolsheviks who were, one by one, airbrushed out of Stalin's party photographs, Hoffa's presence began to fade from the office, picture by picture, plaque by plaque, until any trace of him and his family had vanished. Fitz also booted Hoffa's loyalists, replacing them with his own men. If anyone complained about the changes, Fitz either got rid of them too, or reminded them that he was only in charge because of the great Jimmy Hoffa and bore no accountability to lesser men. Like the Roman Emperor Claudius, who was presumed to be an idiot when he was placed on the throne and was later responsible for Fitz, who was thought of by many as unbelievably stupid, proved the Teamsters in many ways. Unlike Hoffa, who ran the Union like a drill sergeant, Fitz encouraged a relaxed atmosphere and decentralized authority, giving vice presidents more autonomy over regional matters than they had ever enjoyed under Hoffa. He added over 500,000 new members to the union, created a health and safety department, and raised hourly wages. By 1972, the Teamsters were the largest and only major union to stand behind the re-election of President Nixon, who called Fitz my kind of labor leader. Nixon invited the former Detroit bus driver to White House galas. They flew together on Air Force One and teed off together at La Costa Fairways, a California country club built with a $27 million loan from the Teamsters Pension Fund and known as the Mecca for racketeers from all over the country. With the exception of Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, mob bosses across the nation were happier with Fitz than they had ever been with Hoffa. Sure, Hoffa knew how to keep the mob happy since they controlled enough union delegates to keep him in power, but if a loan application did not strike Hoffa as a sound investment for the Teamsters, Hoffa was not afraid to say no to any mafia don. Back in September 1963, the FBI recorded a conversation in which Sam Giancana complained that Hoffa had rejected a $3 million loan request from the Chicago mob. One high said that Hoffa often said no to the mob, didn't give a reason why. A Detroit capo was overheard telling his brother, Jimmy Hoffa is the type of guy you can't bulldog. This same capo referred to Fitz as the puppet, and the same Teamster noted above said, when Fitzsimmons became general president, the fucking door was open for everybody. Fitz's open door policy enraged Hoffa, as did Fitz's opulent lifestyle. Regardless of how high Hoffa had climbed, he was a proverbial working man who disliked luxuries. He wore white socks with dress suits because colored ones make my feet sweat, often telling people I don't need to impress anybody. While Hoffa was president, he took few vacations and would not even let a bellhop carry his luggage at a hotel. While Fitz seemed to be on one long vacation, surrounded by personal servants, Fitz played golf 5 times a week, dined at exclusive country clubs, had a chauffeur driven limousine, chefs, and a private jet, all paid for by the union. This decadent lifestyle for the representative of America's working men was too much for Hoffa to bear. But by the time Hoffa tried to get rid of Fitz, it was too late. The ex shoeshine boy was too deeply entrenched for Hoffa to dislodge him by legal means. Hoffa therefore turned to Marcello and Trafficante, asking them to whack Fitz. However, this was not as acceptable as killing President Kennedy, who everyone in the mob wanted dead. La Costa Nostra has strict rules, and in this particular case, the Chicago and Detroit Borgatas had their claws deep into Fitz, as did the New Yorkers, especially the Genovese family, whose chief liaison to Hoffa was Capo Anthony Provenzano. Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano was born in 1917 on New York's Lower East Side. He was an amateur boxer before becoming a truck driver and protege of Tony Bender, who made him a union organizer. With the backing of the Genovese family, Tony Pro became head of the 14,000 member 560 in Hoboken, New Jersey, of Joint Council 73, an association of locals stretching across the state. This gave Tony Pro immense power over the trucking companies, out of state trucks that drove cargo through New Jersey and had to pay a tax to Tony Pro for crossing his territory. One Teamster described Tony Pro's modus operandi as old school, saying, "You get it is fucking local, you live by whatever contract they negotiate, and there's no shits." He didn't want to hear it. And if an employer didn't sign the contract or didn't agree with him, he'd send a couple of his guys over there and they agreed. In 1957, Tony Pro used his power to help Hoffa clinched the Teamster presidency. Hoffa, in return, helped Tony Pro become one of the Teamsters' 13 international vice presidents. In 1962, before Tony Bender fell out of favor with Vito Genovese, then disappeared without a trace, he was suspected of smuggling heroin through New Jersey's waterfront, which was under the control of the Genovese family. Since Tony was Tony Bender's hand-picked Teamster representative in New Jersey, and trucks were used to move the heroin, Pro was suspected of conspiring with Bender and was put on notice. On June 24th, 1962, he woke up at the bottom of an elevator shaft with 6 broken ribs. After being patched up at the hospital, Tony Pro claimed he had accidentally stepped into an empty shaft on the first floor and had fallen straight into the basement. Pro left out the part where he was beaten, kicked, and thrown down the shaft. His attackers did not mean to kill him, just tune him up, since the 12-foot drop is the recommended height for commanding someone's immediate attention on any given matter. Tony Pro got the message and returned to work, where he remained until 1963, when, due to pressure from Bobby Kennedy, he was convicted of extortion and sent to prison for 7 years. In 1967, Tony serving time in Lewisburg. Oh, thank you, ma'am. When in walked Jimmy Hoffa. Crow was thrilled to see Hoffa, figuring they could catch up and make plans for the future. Hoffa was embittered and beginning to rethink his costly relationship with the mob. He felt they had used him, and his most recent proof was how fast they dumped him for Fitz. Since Hoffa was still the union's official president and was expected to retake the helm release, Pro asked him if he could collect an early retirement settlement against his union pension, worth in the area of $1 million. Long before Hoffa went to prison, a federal court-appointed board of monitors established to clean up the Teamsters ordered Hoffa to oust Tony Pro, but the stout union leader refused and never wavered in his support of the Genovese capo. But now that Hoffa was behind bars and the mob had cozied up to Fitz, he suddenly wanted to purge all mafia influence from his union. Knowing that Tony Pro was already collecting 2 salaries, one from Local 560 and another from Joint Council 73, Hoffa told him no dice. A fellow inmate who witnessed the exchange quoted Hoffa as saying, "I dealt with you guys and it almost got me killed before, and it's got me, so I'm here now, and I don't like it in here. When you get out, you guys are going to have to be on your own." The same inmate said that Tony Pro did not like Hoffa's response and flew into a rage until they were screaming and almost came to blows. Tony's cheeks were red and twitching. He was so mad. Pro finally said to Hoffa, "If you don't get out of my shits and back off me, you'll end up like Castellito. They won't find so much as a fingernail of yours." A prison employee confirmed the inmate's story. Tony Pro's reference to Castellito made the threat all the more ominous, since Anthony Castellito was the secretary treasurer for Local 560, and for years he committed fraud and with Tony Pro. Castellito's mistake came in 1959 when he ran for re-election to secretary treasurer, but not on the vote pro ticket. Castellito's sudden from Tony Pro made Pro wonder if Castellito was planning to run against him for local president. This turned out to be the case. 61, Castellito headed up an opposition ticket and declared his candidacy. Castellito had, following a union hall meeting, Castellito went out for a cup of coffee and was never seen again. Tony Pro was responsible for his disappearance, but he had a solid alibi. He was getting married that day. But Pro's buddy Salvatore Sally Bugs Bergoglio could not attend Pro's wedding. He was busy strangling Castellito to death with a piano wire and pushing his body through a wood chipper in upstate New York. One of Pro's campaign slogans was "Grow and Grow with Tony Pro," an apt catchphrase after Castellito was turned into fertilizer. Needless to say, Tony Pro's threat of ending up like Castellito should not have been taken lightly by Hoffa, who sidled up to another inmate and high-ranking mobster for protection, Bonanno family consigliere Carmine Lillo Galanti. Lillo and Tony Pro despised one another, probably because when Lillo offered Hoffa protection, Pro would have viewed Lillo as butting his nose where it did not belong. Since Lillo did not have a claim on Hoffa nor any right to interfere, he was still a consigliere, which ranks above a capo. This meant that Hoffa would stay for the moment. Hoffa, however, had other problems. The energetic king of labor, with a superhuman work ethic, found the stillness of prison intolerable, calling it hell on earth. Only hell couldn't be this bad. Although the prison wardrobe may have been a step up in fashion from Hoffa's usual cheap suits with white socks, his 8-foot by 10-foot cell with steel bed and toilet was equal to confining him to a straitjacket. His hair grayed, his cheeks became sunken, and he lost weight. Then there was the violence. Hoffa was a certified tough guy, and Lila was keeping Tony Pro at bay, but maximum security prison is still a dangerous jungle where prison-made weapons and sneak attacks are rampant. The famous union leader felt he was a bright target and was concerned for his life. During his stay at Lewisburg, 4 inmates were murdered with knives. As a Lewisburg alumni, I can attest to the violence. On my very first day at the compound in August 1997, 2 inmates were viciously hacked to death with prison-made machetes. Hoffa had the added stress of worrying about his wife, Josephine, known as Jo. Unlike typical mob wives who grow up in the life and understand the risks involved, Jo was not taking any of this well. Lastly, as Hoffa was losing his grip over the Teamsters, he began to lose his mind, which was inextricably tied to the union, making it no surprise that the two would deteriorate in tandem. With President Nixon in office, Carlos Marcelo restarted his drive to get Hoffa out of prison. Bobby Baker, a peddler who leaked tidbits of incriminating evidence about Teamster President Dave Beck, which helped bring about Beck's downfall. Jimmy knew he was next in line to succeed Beck, said one Teamster. It was just a matter of getting him out of the way. Further evidence that Hoffa was prepared to snitch came from Walter Sheridan, formerly of the Get Hoffa Squad, who said that Hoffa had made overtures to the Justice Department even before his release from Lewisburg. As Christmas drew near, wrote Sheridan, a delegation of Teamsters visited the White House and promised Hoffa's cooperation before a grand jury in return for his release from prison. Hoffa all but confirmed Sheridan's story when he appeared on a 30th November 1974 segment of ABC News Close Up titled Hoffa. I should look that one up. I bet that's on YouTube. The widely viewed television segment delved into the Teamsters' links to organized crime, and although Hoffa made no confessions and did not point fingers, his mere participation with the show concerned mobsters across the country who believed that Hoffa was the primary source of the news team's investigation. On June 13th, 1974, Hoffa was interviewed by a television station. When Fitz's name came up, Hoffa said, I understand from reliable sources that Fitzsimmons is seeing a psychiatrist twice a week, adding that Fitz was an alcoholic. Hoffa seemed obsessed with destroying Fitz, exhibiting the same maniacal rants he had once spewed toward Bobby Kennedy. Fitz, in turn, called Hoffa a bum, has-been, a liar, and a stool pigeon. Next, Hoffa sat down to write his autobiography with author Oscar Freely, who co-wrote The Untouchables with G-Man Elliot Ness. Hoffa's story begins with a hypocritical tirade in which he accuses Fitz of everything he had previously done himself. I charge him with selling out to mobsters and letting known racketeers into the Teamsters. I charge him with making vast loans from the billion-dollar Teamster pension fund to known mobsters. Although the book was not yet published, the mob knew about it through others who had heard Hoffa communicating with Fraley over the telephone. I think the years he did in prison really mentally destroyed him a lot, said a Teamster who once looked up to Hoffa. The same man also said he got a lot of people nervous, a lot of people very nervous. It was apparent that if Hoffa could not rule the house, he was bent on burning it down. And with so many Borgatas entangled in Teamster locals and the Union Pension Fund, which dished out half of its $1.2 billion in loans to mob-connected ventures between 1957 and the early 1970s, the mob felt threatened and had no choice but to keep Hoffa away from the Marble Palace, one way or another. Chapter 29, Where's Hoffa? Sylvia Pagano Paris was a secretary for a labor union where she met and married Kansas City mobster Sam Scarandino, who changed his name to Frank O'Brien. On December 20th, 1933, the couple had a son named Charles Lenton O'Brien, better known as Chucky. After Frank O'Brien committed suicide, Sylvia and her 7-year-old son moved to Detroit, where Sylvia dated Detroit mobster Frank Coppola, who introduced Sylvia to Jimmy Hoffa, beginning Hoffa's long relationship with the Detroit mob, as well as with Sylvia, who he briefly dated. After the death of Sylvia's second husband, she moved into Hoffa's home with 9-year-old Chucky, who Hoffa treated as his own son. The boy often called Hoffa Dad, while Hoffa referred to him as my other son. Future Teamster boss Jackie Presser said Hoffa loved Chuck as a true son, and Chuck loved Hoffa as a father. Sylvia got along well with Hoffa's wife Jo and earned her keep while part of the Hoffa household. Not by washing dishes and dusting furniture, but as her role as Hoffa's liaison to the Detroit mob, often acting as a conduit for Teamster pension fund loans to mob connected projects. Hoffa had no trouble saying no to mob bosses, though he did have trouble saying no to Sylvia, who knew how to handle the battle hardened labor leader. My mother had big balls, said Chucky. In those days, most women were intimidated. She wasn't. I don't care who it was. If she had to do something, if somebody asked her to do something, she'd get the job done. In December 1970, when Hoffa was still in prison, 56-year-old Sylvia died of a heart attack, and the only woman who could handle Jimmy Hoffa was gone. To convey messages to Hoffa while he was still in prison, the mob turned to Sylvia's son, Chucky O'Brien, who regularly visited Hoffa in Lewisburg and also carried messages between him and Fitz. O'Brien started out as a truck driver and became an agent for Detroit Local 299. When Hoffa ascended to the presidency, he elevated O'Brien to a general organizer and assistant to the president. As Frank Fitzsimmons slowly took over the union and Hoffa expressed his scathing discontent from prison, O'Brien felt stuck in the middle of their feud and had turned to another mentor for advice, a man Sylvia had always trusted to discipline her son when he was a boy, Tony Jack, who O'Brien referred to as Uncle Tony. Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone was born to Sicilian immigrant parents on the east side of Detroit on January 19th, 1919. His father was a hard-working fruit and vegetable pushcart peddler, but the boy gravitated toward crime and got in with the Detroit mob. He was groomed by mob boss Joe Cirilli, an Italian immigrant who rose from the bootleg gangs of the 1920s to become the reputed czar of the Detroit Mafia. Cirilli grew to depend on Tony Jack. Oh, thank you, Jerry. And raised him to a capo, wearing Brioni suits and large tinted prescription eyeglasses. Those look so 70s on this guy. There's a picture I can show you. Well, it's a mugshot, an FBI mugshot. I'll say, date of birth 1919, weight 195, height 6 foot, date May 14, 1975. Tony Jack handed out business cards advertising himself as the president of an exterminating company, which was rather comical to FBI agents who said his propensity for violence is legendary in Detroit, and he was known to exterminate quite a few people. By 1975, Tony Jack and Jimmy Hoffa had known each other for about 30 years, and their relationship was reciprocal. Tony Jack's rise in the Detroit mob was, in large part, due to Hoffa's meteoric rise in the American labor movement, which depended on Tony Jack. Tony Jack was not only the designated contact between the Detroit mafia and the Teamster hierarchy, but often acted as Hoffa's bridge to other borgadas across the country, especially the Chicago mob, which controlled Teamster locals in the Midwest. When Hoffa fell out with Fitz and Chucky went to Tony Jack for advice, Tony Jack told Chucky to shift his allegiance to Fitz, making it clear where the mob stood. He's your fucking boss, nobody else, said Tony Jack, who also told Chucky to essentially act as a spy. Stay put, keep quiet, and listen. Upon Hoffa's release from prison, Tony Jack desperately tried to get him to accept that had occurred in at one point promising Hoffa anything he wanted apart from the Teamsters. He said they would install him at the head of any company under their control and even offer $10 million to quietly fade away. Hoffa refused every offer. He only wanted his Teamster and continued to make threats that would sink the mob if he did not get his way. At one of his many visits to Hoffa's lakefront house, Tony Jack told Hoffa very calmly, "You've got to stop what you're doing, Jim. You're not only hurting yourself, you're hurting everybody." Chucky said Hoffa listened, but never said nothing. He showed respect to Uncle Tony, but he just listened. Chucky also said Uncle Tony hated anybody to snitch. He told me to never rat anybody out because people like that, time will take care of them. More often than not, time enlisted the help of Tony Jack, who displayed uncharacteristic patience in the face of Hoffa's threats and continued to plead with him. The reason for Tony Jack's restraint was not because he was a sympathetic man, but because Hoffa was a national hero to the labor movement, and his murder would bring the mob untold heat. While Tony Jack persisted in his failing diplomatic mission, violence plagued the Teamster Union as men loyal to either Hoffa or Fitz took swipes at each other. Homes were blown up, cars and boats were firebombed, and men were shot at. One victim who survived a shooting said, "My eye actually came out of my head." Finally, on July 10th, 1975, Hoffa's men targeted Fitz's son, Richard, whose car was blown to smithereens in the parking lot of Nemo's, a tavern frequented by Teamsters from a nearby local. Richard, who was reported to be at the center of an internal struggle, was not in the car and was hustled off the scene by other union officials. While parts of the car were found blocks away, Richard's near death experience drove Fitz straight into the arms of his mafia guardians, namely Detroit capo Tony Jack and Genovese capo Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, who was now out of prison and concerned by Hoffa's threats to expose the mob. The two Tonys reluctantly decided that Hoffa had to go and went about getting approval from the commission. Tony Pro's Genovese family easily got the Gambino and Lucchese families on board. Detroit Don Joe Zerilli gave it the okay, as did the boss of rural Pennsylvania, Rosario Russell Buffalino, who was heavily involved with the Teamsters. The Chicago mob, with its iron grip over Teamster locals, in not only their own Windy City, but Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Kansas City, Cleveland, and St. Louis. Also understood what had to be done. As for Carlos Marcello and Santa Traficante, their hands were tied. Given Hoffa's threats to inform, they had no choice but to go along with his death sentence. Once the hit was sanctioned by the commission, Tony Jack, who was closest to Hoffa, was assigned the task of setting him up for the kill. To this end, he pushed Hoffa to air out his old prison grievances with Tony Pro, offering to arrange a meeting between them. Back when Hoffa and Pro were first released from prison, they met in Miami where both men had vacation homes. The meeting quickly descended into part two of their Lewisburg bout when, according to Hoffa, Pro threatened to pull my guts out or kidnap my children if I continue to attempt to return to the presidency of the Teamsters. Lloyd Hicks of Miami's Local 390, controlled by Santo Traficante, made the mistake of bragging to friends that he had secretly tape recorded the meeting and thus the threat. Hicks was soon found dead with a dozen bullet holes, and the tape has never resurfaced. On another occasion, while Tony Pro was in Miami, he bumped into a former assistant to Hoffa, Joe Pinau, and told him, "Tell Hoffa I'm going to snatch his granddaughter and pull her eyes out." Given the above, Hoffa prudently declined Tony Jack's pleas to meet again with Tony Pro. But Hoffa knew if he planned to run in 1976, regardless of how loud he barked about purging the Union or Mafia influence, he needed the delegates they controlled. A monkey could do the math. Detective Vincent Piersanti, who Life magazine called one of the foremost authorities on organized crime in the Detroit, Northern Ohio area, said because of the mob's tremendous influence in the Teamsters Union, Hoffa had no chance of returning to power unless the mob okayed it. That is a fact of life. Hoffa therefore gave in and agreed to sit with Tony Pro, but only after a last-ditch attempt at enlisting the help of his old prison protector, Carmine Lilo Galanti, who was released from penitentiary on January 24th, 1974, after serving 12 years of his 20-year sentence. Given the forces aligned against Hoffa, Lilo would have immediately known he was powerless to alter events, but he was also aware of the hundreds of millions of dollars connected to the Teamster Pension Fund, so he resorted to a common ploy in the mob. He made a phony claim on Hoffa based on their relationship in prison, hoping to get something out of it. A New Jersey bank under Tony Pro's control made a $25,000 loan to Lilo, and I would bet the farm that this was a payoff to have Lilo withdraw his beef, which he did. With nowhere else to turn, Hoffa agreed to meet with Tony Pro. On the days leading up to the meeting, it was obvious to the people around Hoffa that he had developed a fatalistic outlook, telling his son-in-law, "I've been fortunate. I was just a farm boy from Brazil, Indiana, and I became president of the world's greatest union. I've been able to smell the roses. How many other people can say that?" Hoffa talked to others about having lived a full life with no regrets as he inched closer to smelling the roses from the other side of the soil. On the morning of July 30th, 1975, Hoffa lounged around his house following a long, sleepless night. By 1 p.m., he told his wife he had a 2 p.m. appointment at the Matches Red Fox, a steak and seafood restaurant located in the suburb of Bloomfield, Michigan. approximately 15 miles north of downtown Detroit. The busy area might have given Hoffa a sense of security. At around 1:15 p.m., Hoffa left his Lake Orion house in his dark green Pontiac Grandville. On his way to the meeting, he stopped off at a limousine company run by his pal Louis the Pope Lintau, who was out to lunch. Hoffa and Lintau went back 3 or 4 decades together, and throughout Hoffa's most recent ordeal with the mob, Lintau sometimes served as a messenger between Hoffa and Tony Jack. Lintau's employees said that Hoffa was extremely upset that Lintau was not there and felt that Lintau should have known to wait around. Was Lintau supposed to accompany Hoffa to the 2 p.m. meeting? If so, Lintau knew when to duck out or was lured away so Hoffa would be alone. After some small talk with the employees, during which Hoffa seemed kind of nervous about something, Hoffa left for the match's Red Fox. Hoffa arrived at the restaurant between 1:45 and 2 p.m. and parked his car in the parking lot. Neither Tony Pro nor Tony Jack, who was to accompany Tony Pro, was there. At around 2:30 p.m., Hoffa walked across the parking lot to a hardware store where he made 2 telephone calls from a public phone. The first call was to Lintau at his limousine service. Hoffa sounded aggravated when he told Lintau he had been stood up. A frustrating experience, but he should have been so lucky. Hoffa's second call was to his wife, Jo Giacalone. Didn't show up, he said. Did he call? Where the hell is he? Jo said that she had not heard from Tony Jack or anyone else. Hoffa told her that he would be home by 4 p.m. and hung up the phone. Following the phone calls, at approximately 2:45 p.m., witnesses saw Hoffa walking across the parking lot on his way back to his car when a maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis rolled up alongside him and stopped. There were 3 men in the car, 2 seated in the front and 1 in the back. The door opened and Hoffa climbed into the back seat. It was the last time anyone has ever seen Jimmy Hoffa. Jo expected to see her husband by 4 p.m. When he did not show up at home or call to explain why he was running late, she became nervous and was too upset to eat dinner. By 10 p.m., she anxiously telephoned Hoffa's fellow Teamster and family friend, Joe Bain, who drove over to Hoffa's house. Before the evening was up, Hoffa's adult children, Jimmy and Barbara, were told that their father had not come home. As the overnight hours passed, with dreadful uncertainty, the Hoffa family wondered when to report Hoffa missing. Knowing he could still walk through the front door, as that prospect began to fade, they clung to the hope of a ransom demand, which could mean he was still alive. At around 10 p.m., Louis Lintau called Hoffa's home on the lake and learned from Joe that Hoffa had never returned home. Lintau then called Tony Jack, who told him he had no meeting planned with Hoffa that day and did not even know what Lintau was talking about. Lintau, who knew this was a blatant lie, would have seen this as confirmation that Hoffa was gone for good. The next morning, Lintau drove to the Match's Red Fox and found Hoffa's car in the parking lot with the doors unlocked. By 6 p.m., just over 24 hours after Hoffa had last been seen, his family filed a missing persons report. James Hoffa Jr., who did not believe the mob would tolerate his father's return to the Teamsters, was pretty sure of what had happened, though he had difficulty coming to terms with it. The investigation into Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance started out slow and never picked up speed. After a long weekend of public pressure to enter the case, the FBI finally caved on the evening of Sunday, August 3rd, and assigned only two Detroit agents, which attested to the Bureau's lack of interest. Unhappy with the scant resources dedicated to the investigation, Hoffa's daughter Barbara, who later became a judge, said, "You used 2,000 agents to put my father in jail, and you're only using two to find him." Hoffa's car was searched by authorities, but revealed no traces of a crime. Inside Hoffa's house, Hoffa had written a memo to himself that read, TJ, 2 p.m., Red Fox. Everyone knew that TJ was Tony Jack, who Hoffa was planning to meet that afternoon. She's not reading the chat. I'm sorry, did you say something earlier? Because all I see is like one message. Oh, thank you, Rob. Thank you for your flower bush. Um, and I had been responding to the chat earlier, which makes me think you weren't even here, but are still commenting on my reading of the chat, which is very interesting. Anyway, where was I? Of the six witnesses who saw Hoffa in the parking lot, one said that he had left in a car with three men and identified Chucky O'Brien as the driver of that car, which was believed to have belonged to Tony Jack's son, Joseph Joey Jack Gia Cologne. Although Chucky may not have been in the car, he was in the know. When questioned the next day by James Hoffa Jr., Chucky told conflicting stories about his whereabouts on the day of Hoffa's disappearance. The reason was not necessarily because Chucky was involved, but because Chucky was asked by Tony Jack to alibi him at one of his favorite haunts, the Southfield Athletic Club, where Tony Jack spent the afternoon coming into contact with as many people as possible. Oh, thank you, MM. Okay. With your heart eyes. Yes, Joseph, Joey, Jack. It's your first time? That's so nice. See, I wouldn't have thought that because somebody by your same exact name who writes like you um has been here a lot before. But welcome. There's a lot of Joeys, there's a lot of Tonys. Um, yeah. There's Tonys and Anthony's. My neighbor's doing like some kind of work outside. Like I can hear and she's like really upset. And it's like I kind of want to be like, shut up. Ugh. When the Hoffa children asked Chucky to take a polygraph test, the man who was known as a pathological liar declined, telling them he would need to consult with his attorney. On the Friday after Hoffa disappeared, Tony Jack was scheduled to attend a wedding, but decided to skip it and take his wife to dinner along with Chucky O'Brien. When Tony Jack's wife left for the ladies' room, Tony Jack said to Chucky, "Life is very funny, Chuck, very funny. Things happen and you don't have control over it." Wait, what? Before parting ways for the evening, Tony Jack told Chucky to visit Fitz at the Marble Palace and tell him to lie low and avoid television interviews. Another witness who had seen Hoffa climb into a car identified the passenger as Salvatore Sally Bugs Briguglio, the hitman Tony Pro had used to dispose of Anthony Castellito, who was pushed through a wood chipper in upstate New York. Bugs was on the books as a business agent for Tony Pro's Local 560. Back in 1971, Sally Bugs, Stephen Angelo, Armand Cookie Fabno, and Tony Pro's brother, Sammy Pro, who also golfed with President Nixon, were indicted on federal counterfeiting charges. Since Sammy Pro was too important for Tony Pro to lose, a little arrangement was worked out in which Sally Bugs disposed of Cookie Fabno and Stephen Angelo, then took the rap for Sammy Pro. As for Tony Pro, telephone toll records revealed that he and Tony Jack had spoken with one another dozens of times from April until July, with the calls suddenly ceasing a few days before Hoffa disappeared. The calls never resumed. This pattern is typical in such circumstances and is as close as we will ever get to physical evidence of their involvement. The two men were in contact while presumably planning the hit and apparently decided as the big day neared to distance themselves from one another, knowing that any post hit telephone conversations could be recorded. Tony Pro was also seen in Detroit by the FBI in the days leading up to Hoffa's disappearance, but was back home in New Jersey on the day it happened. More circumstantial evidence that points to his guilt. The following day, Tony Pro flew to Florida, the same place he had gone when Castellito disappeared. A team of reporters descended on his home in Miami. In a telling statement, Tony Pro told reporters, "Jimmy was or is my friend." Although Tony Pro could argue that the was applicable because they had since argued and their friendship had dissolved, it seemed more like a Freudian slip. Pro knew Hoffa was dead. He went on to say, "You're embarrassing me in front of everyone in the neighborhood. You guys making me look like a mobster. I'm not. I'm just a truck driver. I'm just a truck driver." Unlike most truck drivers, the sun-tanned, bare-chested 58-year-old was wearing swim trunks on his sprawling front lawn in the middle of the day. Just 3 months, and there's a picture of this, by the way. I can show you too. Just 3 months after Hoffa went missing, the annual Frank Fitzsimmons Invitational Golf Tournament of 1975 was held at La Costa Country Club and had some interesting players teeing off together. The recent impeached president, Richard Nixon, shared a golf cart with Fitz, which must have made for interesting conversation. being that Nixon said that Fitz can't string three words together. The New York Times wrote, among the participants were Anthony Provenzano, former ally of James R. Hoffa, the missing former Teamster president. The Times further reported after he finished his round of golf, Mr. Nixon spent about 45 minutes in a private meeting with a number of Teamster officials and others linked to the union. Following Hoffa's demise, Chucky O'Brien was seen wearing a Fitz 76 campaign button, clearing up any ambiguity as to where he stood in the Hoffa Fitz feud. There was blood found in Joey Jack's car, which Chucky admitted to borrowing on the day in question. The blood was tested and said to be salmon blood. FBI tracking dogs detected Hoffa's scent in the right rear seat and trunk of the car, and a strand of hair found inside the car matched a strand plucked from Hoffa's hairbrush at his home. The FBI did not bring charges. James Hoffa Jr. made a public plea for help while outdated free Hoffa bumper stickers were covered with Where's Hoffa bumper stickers. Hoffa's children offered a $200,000 reward for information. Hoffa's alma mater, Detroit Local 299, put up another $25,000. And Overdrive magazine, which spoke for the rank and file Teamsters, put up $50,000, but there were no viable leads. Responding to public pressure to solve the case, the feds stepped up the investigation. Since they could not find Hoffa's body, they went after the Teamsters Pension Fund, which Jackie O'Brien called the whole ball of wax. The FBI focused mainly on Fitz, whose marble palace was less than a mile away from the J. Edgar Hoover building. Fitz was regularly questioned about his relationships with Hoffa and Tony Pro, and before long, his involvement in a number of dirty loans came to light. He was forced to resign from the union, and an outside management team was appointed to oversee the pension funds, delivering a blow to the mob that was equal to the end of Prohibition. Sure, they still had control of union locals across the country, but the pension fund party was over and done. Within 6 months of Hoffa's disappearance, Tony Pro was indicted for a shady $2.3 million pension fund scam. Months after that arrest, he and Sally Buggs were picked up for the 1961 kidnapping and murder of Anthony Costellito. It was 1 year since Hoffa's disappearance, and several years since Tony Pro had warned Hoffa that he would end up like Castellito, a promise he had apparently kept, since we have not found so much as a fingernail belonging to Jimmy Hoffa. During Tony Pro's criminal trials, Sammy Pro held the fort at Union headquarters in New Jersey, where he fit rather comfortably into his brother's shoes. One night during a shop stewards meeting, local 560 member Walter Glockner launched an insurrection, vowing to fight Tony Pro until they put me in a pine box. Glockner, who was also suspected of snitching, did not have to wait long for that to happen. The very next night, he was gunned down outside of his home. Sammy Pro tried to appear sympathetic by ruling Glockner's death an accident so that his family could collect a death benefit. When reporters asked, he told them that Glockner was accident prone, which was true if we apply an equally broad definition of the word accident. Glockner's latest and final accident was to challenge Tony Pro. Toward the end of 1975, Chucky O'Brien was living in South Florida, where Tony Pro and Tony Jack also had winter homes. One afternoon, Tony Jack dialed Chucky and told him to meet him at Tony Pro's house in an hour. Chucky was a bit shaken by the sudden phone call, but got his courage up and went. He greeted the men in Tony Pro's backyard, where the wise guys were sitting beside a pool. Tony Jack was dressed in pants and a shirt, while Tony Pro was in his work attire, which he also donned for press conferences, swim trunks with no shirt and slippers. Tony Pro, fearing his house was under constant surveillance, from across the intercoastal waterway, led Tony Jack and Chucky a few steps away from the pool where they ducked behind a row of large bushes. Tony Pro told Chucky, "We just want to know that you're okay," and went on to say the little guy, Hoffa, had lost his fucking mind and was going to take everybody down. Chucky later described this tense situation to his astute stepson, who accurately assessed the motive behind the confrontation, concluding that Tony Jack had vouched for Chucky, who was in the know, but Tony Pro wanted to look Chucky in the eyes and judge for himself. The mere fact that Chucky arrived at Tony Pro's house after such a cold and spontaneous invitation, knowing he could be walking into an ambush, would have begun the process of easing Tony Pro's mind even before the men had spoken behind the bush. Later in life, Chucky all but admitted the mob's guilt when he told his stepson, "Whatever happened, I didn't have the power to change it." In 1977, Sally Buggs made a disastrous decision to sit for an interview with author Steve Brill, who was writing a book about the Teamsters. The ground rule, said Brill, explaining how he got Buggs to talk, was that I would not reveal our discussions, which were conducted privately. Buggs was still relatively tight-lipped, Brill wrote. He only possibly confirmed with a nod of his head certain relatively minor aspects of the crime. He offered no elaboration and never revealed enough to implicate anyone except possibly himself. Why did Sally Buggs sit down with Brill? Was he trying to discern how much the FBI knew about the crime, aware that investigative reporters regularly speak with members of law enforcement? Or was Buggs just plain nuts, as the name implied? Whatever his reasoning, his indiscretion leaked, and the Genovese family does not condone interviews. Hoffa was not the only man Buggs had disposed of, and Tony Pro was not the only mobster he had killed for. On March 1978, Sally Buggs was swatted like a bug as he exited a restaurant in Manhattan's Little Italy. 2 hitmen shot at him 5 times in the head and once in the chest, then kept walking as Buggs collapsed into the pavement dead. Thank you, Jerry. In the summer of 1978, Tony Pro was convicted at both trials and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Castellito. 10 years later, in a hospital near his, 10 years later, the 71-year-old capo died of a heart attack while handcuffed to a bed in a hospital near his California prison. He had outlived Fitz, who was whacked by Philip Morris. Mm. The heavy chain smoker succumbed to succumbed to lung cancer in May 1981. Mm. As for Tony Jack, he was jacked up on tax charges and hit with a 10-year bid. He was facing new racketeering indictment when he dropped dead at 82 years old in 2001. Considering that Hoffa's disappearance ultimately led to the demise of Fitz, Tony Pro, Tony Jack, and Sally Bugs, it can be said that Hoffa got his revenge from the grave. One might argue that the only real victims are the families of the deceased. Jo Hoffa went to her grave in 1980 asking till the end, "Where's my Jimmy?" What happened to Jimmy Hoffa on the day of his disappearance? And where is his body? Hoffa was murdered, and a number of informants have pointed the finger at Sally Bugs and his brother, along with Thomas and Dretta. All three were career criminals directly connected to the Union and the Genovese family, specifically Tony Pro. And Dretta was also one of the prime suspects in Sally Bugs' death, which meant that he did not particularly care for Sally Bugs' interview with author Stephen Brill. As for Hoffa's body, I am certain it was destroyed. Given Hoffa's notoriety and the expected manhunt that would follow in the wake of his disappearance, the mob had no choice but to dispose of him. Over the years, false tips have sent investigators on wild goose chases. One informant said that Hoffa was in the concrete foundation of New Jersey Giants Stadium. Another said that he was in the concrete abutment of a bridge. Yet another claimed he was stuffed into a 55-gallon drum and shipped to a New Jersey landfill. As recently as July 2022, a new search was conducted under a New Jersey bridge. I assure you, none of these leads are valid. I could have saved the FBI a lot of time and money by telling them to stop listening to chatterboxes who pretend to know what they're talking about. A hit team would never have risked the dangers involved in transporting a corpse hundreds of miles when there were a million places to dispose of Hoffa's body in Michigan. Given the variety of leads that were considered at the time, I am absolutely convinced that Hoffa's last stop was the Central Sanitation Services in Hamtramck, Michigan, a shredder compactor incinerator facility owned by Detroit Borgata members Raphael Jimmy Q. Serrano and Peter Bozzi Vital. Vital was a capo, and Serrano would rise to the rank of consigliere a few years after Hoffa disappeared. Their business was located less than 20 miles from the Matches Red Fox restaurant, about as long as anyone would want to travel with a body. Two confidential informants, both deemed credible by the FBI on account of their long history of providing reliable information, said that Hoffa was disposed of in this incinerator. An FBI memo citing one of the informants added that Serrano and Vital had gotten rid of at least 10 murder victims for the Detroit Mafia in any one of their three garbage dumps in the months leading up to Hoffa's disappearance. Telephone toll records revealed a series of long distance calls between Pennsylvania Don Russell Buffalino, Vital, and Serrano, who Hoffa had admitted to knowing for about 10 years while being grilled by Bobby Kennedy years earlier. Fitz was also friendly with Serrano and Vital and had visited them a few days before Hoffa disappeared. And Fitz's son, Donald, as opposed to Richard, had once worked for Serrano's vending machine company. The U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey discovered that in December 1974, when Tony Jack first began nudging Hoffa to meet with Tony Pro, Teamster funds were deposited into the Bank of Bloomfield, part of which formed a business loan of $85,000 to the Central Sanitation Services owned by Serrano and Vital. The loan, which was never repaid, was supposedly used to purchase a garbage disposal machine. Incinerating Hoffa would have settled the debts. When Serrano and Vital were questioned by the law, they were both non-compliant, and one of their lawyers said in their defense, "These men are not sophisticated individuals. They don't speak the English language fluently. They both spoke perfect English." In 1978, author Stephen Brill quoted an FBI affidavit that stated Hoffa's body was destroyed by means of a shredder, compactor, and/or incinerator located on the premises. And Brill pointed out that no search warrant was ever requested, issued, or executed by the FBI concerning the sanitation company. Given the typical formula for interfamily hits, it makes sense that the Genovese family supplied an out-of-town hit team while their Detroit counterparts disposed of the body. What many people believe to be the most plausible account of Hoffa's death was published in the book I Heard You Paint Houses by Frank Sheeran, later made into a movie, The Irishman. Based on the hype, I feel obligated to address Sheeran's deathbed confession in which he claimed to have killed Hoffa. To Sheeran's credit, there are a number of facts contained in his book that are indisputable. Sheeran was a legitimate mobster who answered directly to Russell Bufalino, and Bufalino was close with Tony Jack and in contact with Serrano and Vital in the months leading up to Hoffa's disappearance. This evidence and more, albeit circumstantial, points to Bufalino's involvement in the conspiracy. The questions are, what part, if any, did Sheeran play in the conspiracy, and is his story solid? In 2001, Sheeran first stated that Sally Bugs had killed Hoffa, a claim supported by reliable FBI informants. In 2003, Sheeran suddenly changed his story and said that he himself had killed Hoffa. Sheeran went on to tell so many blatant lies that documentaries based on his story were halted in mid-production when the producers could not, in good conscience, continue the projects. I have worked in television and can only imagine the level of mendacity that would prompt producers to stop a production in lieu of covering their ears. One of Sheeran's outlandish lies is his claim to have personally committed the hit on Crazy Joe Gallo at Umberto's Clam House, which we have thoroughly covered in chapter 27. Everyone in the mob knows that Sonny Pinto killed Gallo. Not only did Joe Fish Lucarelli watch Sonny Pinto kill Gallo from across the street, then report the details to the FBI, but Pete the Greek unloaded his gun into Pinto's car as Pinto made his escape. Sonny Pinto also went on the lam and never returned, and as of the late 1990s, the Colombo family was still sending him a monthly stipend allotted to him for the sacrifice he had made for the Brigada when whacking Gallo. Why in the world would Sheeran claim responsibility for the hit on Gallo, knowing it was Sonny Pinto, and the hit on Hoffa, knowing it was Sally Bugs? Sheeran's book sold incredibly well, and Netflix dished out somewhere in the area of $200 million to make the movie, giving him 200 million reasons to lie. A highly suspicious fire in March 1976 incinerated the incinerator at Central Sanitation Services when it burned to the ground in what is believed to have been an act of arson. Federal prosecutor Keith Corbett, who worked on the Hoffa investigation, recalled the fire during his retirement, saying betting odds would dictate the fact that the place mysteriously burnt to the ground shortly thereafter wasn't a coincidence. Corbett also said, the best intelligence we received regarding how Hoffa's body was done away with was the central sanitation angle. We were being told a lot of bodies were incinerated there in the 1970s. Vital and Casarano were running out of there at the point in time, and both those two fellas were pegged pretty early on as being involved in this murder. Keith Corbett finally nailed Casarano and Vital on unrelated racketeering charges, and they both died of natural causes in ripe old age, taking the secret of Hoffa's disappearance to their graves. That is the end of chapter 29. We'll pick it up on chapter 30 tomorrow, but I wanted to show you some pictures, so. Hi, this is Lou. Why would they say they moved it to New Jersey? That's like, okay. There's not too many photos, so just gonna take too long to find it. Okay, so this is that one that was Anthony, Tony, Jack, Jan Cologne. Remember how they said they had the tinted prescription eyeglasses, and I said, looks so 70s. Because I'm picturing them kind of like that yellow, orange, and to me, that's just, and it also probably the plaid suit. And someone once told me once you could tell the like eras of men's convenient corpses. That's tomorrow. Fashion from the ties, they can be different eras, like skinnier, thicker. I wouldn't notice that. I would think it's just a style, but okay. What about the other guy that was like on his lawn in his swim trunks right here? Tony Pro questioned by reporters on his front lawn. I was like, hey, what you bother me for? I don't know. It's like this is his work attire. They got the palms. Yeah, Florida. I was like, that's gonna be Florida, right? I don't think there were any others. Sally Bugs. Um, the guy that I think killed him. This guy. In the looks like a long trench coat right there. Putting on gloves or something. All right. So I got something I needed today from them. That was very good. I went in the pool today, first time in a while. That was nice. Um, I got some bunch of groceries in the freezer. I'm gonna make some of it now because I'm hungry and let her out. But that was my day. I missed you. Mm, love you.